The dust in the cabin settled on everything, a fine, pale shroud over a life paused. For Clara, at 22, the dust was a constant companion, a physical manifestation of the stillness that had taken root since her husband, Henry, had been laid in the ground 6 months prior. Her world had shrunk to these 4 walls, and at the center of it, casting the longest shadow, stood her grandmother's dresser. It was a monolith of dark, unadorned timber, plain and heavy and utterly out of place in the cramped room. It took up a third of the living space, a stubborn, silent beast of a thing that offered no beauty, only presence. To the town of redemption, and more pointedly to Henry's family, it was a symbol of her foolishness. Her brother-in-law, Samuel, had been the most vocal. He stood in her doorway just last week, his frame blocking the meager afternoon light, his face a mask of strained patience. "It's scrapwood, Clara," he'd said, his voice laced with the kind of pity that felt more like a weapon. "It's ugly. Let me have a man haul it away. He'll give you $1 for it." A whole dollar. She had simply shaken her head, her gaze fixed on the worn surface of the furniture. The dresser was the last thing she had of Maeve, her grandmother. It had been shipped all the way from the east after Maeve passed, a final, cumbersome gift that had cost more in freight than Samuel believed it was worth. He saw a widow clinging to junk, she saw the only real inheritance she'd ever received. The quiet irony was that in a room defined by its emptiness, the most solid object was the one everyone wanted her to discard. They saw a useless burden. Clara felt an anchor. It was the only thing in her life that felt permanent, that had a history reaching back further than her own brief and unhappy marriage. The bell above the door to Gable's general store announced her arrival with a dull, rusty clank. The air inside was thick with the scent of dried beans, cured leather, and Mr. Gable's own particular brand of disapproval. He was a man whose generosity was measured in fractions and always recorded in a ledger. Clara stood before the counter, her hands clasped tightly, the worn fabric of her dress thin beneath her fingers. "Mr. Gable," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "I need a sack of flour. I can pay you at the end of the month." He stopped wiping the counter and looked at her over the top of his spectacles. His gaze was slow, deliberate, an appraisal that made her feel like a questionable commodity. He sighed, a long, theatrical sound of reluctance. "Your account is getting heavy, Clara. Henry's debt was one thing, but you keep adding to it." He said it loudly enough for the 2 women lingering by the bolt of calico to hear. They stopped their chatter and turned, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and judgment. Clara felt a flush of heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her chin level. "I will settle it," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I always do." Mr. Gable made a noncommittal grunt and heaved a small sack of flour onto the counter, making a new, sharp entry in his book. As Clara turned to leave, the whispers of the women followed her. "Still has that monstrous old dresser, I hear," one murmured. "Clinging to it like it's made of gold. Poor girl's lost her senses along with her husband." Clara pushed the door open, the bell clanking behind her. She didn't look back. They thought she was a fool for holding on to something worthless. They didn't understand. Holding on was the only thing she knew how to do. It was all she had left. Back in the suffocating quiet of her cabin, the flour sack felt like a small victory and a heavy burden all at once. It would last a week, maybe 2. Then she would have to face Mr. Gable's ledger again. Her gaze fell upon the dresser, its dark surface absorbing the slivers of light that fought their way through the grimy window. She ran a rag over the top, her movement slow and methodical. The simple act of cleaning it was a ritual, a connection to the woman who had raised her. A memory surfaced, as clear as if it were yesterday. She was a small girl, watching her grandmother Maeve's hands, wrinkled but strong, moving in slow, loving circles as she polished this very same piece of furniture. The air would fill with the clean scent of lemon oil and beeswax. Maeve never spoke much about the past, but her hands told stories. They told of care, of preservation, of tending to things meant to last. One afternoon, as they worked, Maeve had stopped and looked at her, her eyes a pale, knowing blue. "Some things are worth more than what a man will pay for them, child," she had said, her voice soft but sure. "People see with their eyes. They see size and shine. They don't see the years." They don't see the strength in what endures. You hold on to what's true, Clara. Not what's popular at the time. Clara had thought she was just talking about furniture. Now, standing alone in the dust-filled cabin, she understood. Her grandmother had been talking about everything. About character. About loyalty. About a kind of worth that couldn't be weighed or measured in a general store. The whispers of the town faded. Samuel's impatient voice grew distant. All that remained was the memory of her grandmother's hands and the solid, unyielding presence of the wood beneath her own. Samuel returned 2 days later, and this time he was not alone. The man with him was stout and sweaty, with hands like worn leather mallets. He eyed the dresser with a dismissive glance, as if it had personally offended him. "Clara," Samuel said, skipping any pretense of courtesy. "This is Mr. Finch. He hauls freight. He's offered to take this thing off your hands." Mr. Finch grunted in agreement, his eyes already calculating the effort of moving it. $5, Samuel declared, his tone suggesting this was an act of profound charity. "That's more than fair. It's more than it's worth. You can buy food for a month with that." "Be sensible." Clara looked from Samuel's pinched, determined face to the looming form of the dresser. $5. It was a fortune to her right now. It was food. It was a reprieve from Mr. Gable's disapproving gaze. It was the sensible choice. For a fleeting moment, she wavered. The weight of her hunger, the gnawing anxiety of her debt, it all pressed down on her. The dresser was just wood, wasn't it? A memory couldn't fill her stomach. But then she pictured Maeve's face, heard her quiet words echoing in the silence. "Hold on to what's true." She straightened her shoulders. Her voice, when it came, was so soft the men almost missed it. "No." Samuel's face tightened. "What did you say?" "No," she repeated, a little louder this time, meeting his eyes directly. "It was my grandmother's." "It stays." Samuel stared at her, his disbelief curdling into anger. "You are a fool, Clara. A stubborn, sentimental fool. Don't come to me when you're starving." He turned on his heel and stormed out, Mr. Finch following with a shrug. The door slammed shut, leaving Clara alone again with the silent, stubborn piece of furniture that she had just chosen over a month's worth of food. She had no idea why, but she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she had made the right choice. The days that followed were leaner than any she had known. The flour dwindled, then vanished. She was left with a handful of dried beans and a patch of withered herbs by the door. Desperation was a cold stone in her stomach. The silence in the cabin grew louder, accusing. In the weak evening light, the dresser seemed to mock her. It was a great, useless lump of a thing, a monument to her foolish pride. For the first time, a flicker of resentment sparked within her. Samuel was right. She was a fool. She had chosen a piece of wood over her own survival. She walked over to it, her movement stiff with hunger and regret. She leaned her forehead against the cool, smooth timber. She was so tired. So tired of being strong, of holding on, of fighting a battle no one else could see. Her hand slid down the side of the dresser, her fingers tracing the simple, straight lines. It was a gesture of farewell, of surrender. And that's when she felt it. At the very bottom, just inches from the dusty floorboards, her fingertips brushed against something that was not quite right. A seam. A tiny, almost imperceptible gap where there should have been solid wood. She had run her hands over this dresser 1,000 times and never noticed it. It was a looseness, a give, in a panel that ran along the base. Curiosity, a feeling she hadn't experienced in months, pricked at the edges of her despair. She knelt, her knees cracking, and pressed gently on the spot. The panel moved. If you've ever felt like you were holding on to something that everyone else told you to let go of, maybe this story resonates with you. We find value in the strangest places, and sometimes, the things we protect end up protecting us. If you're enjoying Clara's journey, consider subscribing to the channel for more stories about hidden strength and unexpected discoveries. Her breath caught in her throat. Her heart began a slow, heavy drum against her ribs. She pressed again, harder this time. The wooden panel shifted inward with a soft, dry click. It wasn't a drawer. It wasn't a flaw in the construction. It was a deliberate, hidden mechanism. Her mind, sluggish from hunger, struggled to make sense of it. With trembling fingers, she worked at the edge of the panel, trying to get a purchase. Her nails were useless against the tight fit. She stumbled to the small hearth and returned with the thin, sturdy kitchen knife she used for everything from dicing onions to mending tack. Carefully, she slid the tip of the blade into the seam and pried. The wood groaned in protest. The sound was loud in the dead quiet of the room. The panel popped free, revealing not a shallow space, but a dark, deep cavity. It was a secret compartment, expertly concealed within the dresser's heavy base. And it was not empty. Inside, packed so tightly they seemed to be one solid block, were dozens of bundles wrapped in dark, oiled cloth and tied with simple twine. She reached in, her hand shaking so badly she could barely grasp one. She pulled it out. It was heavy, far heavier than it should be. She placed it on the floor and began to fumble with the knot. The twine fell away, and she unfolded the stiff cloth. Her mind refused to process what she was seeing. It was not jewelry. It was not gold coin. It was paper. Stacks and stacks of clean, crisp banknotes. United States currency, in denominations larger than any she had ever held. She stared at the numbers, at the unfamiliar face of the president printed on the bill. $100. She picked up another. $500. She dropped the bundle, her hand suddenly numb. She reached back into the cavity and pulled out another, and another. They were all the same. Filled with money. A fortune beyond comprehension. She did not count it. To count it would be to make it real, and her mind was not ready for that kind of reality. She simply sat on the rough floorboards, the bundles of impossible wealth piled around her like offerings to a forgotten god. The dust motes danced in the single shaft of fading sunlight, illuminating a scene of silent, overwhelming shock. The hunger in her belly was gone, replaced by a hollow feeling of disbelief. This was Maeve's doing. Her quiet, unassuming grandmother, who had lived a simple life, who had polished her own furniture and grown her own vegetables, had hidden this. It was a secret she had carried to her grave. Why? How? The questions were too large for the small cabin. As she sat there, numb, a wave of grief washed over her, so powerful it took her breath away. It was not just for the loss of her grandmother, but for the profound, staggering love this discovery represented. This was not just money. It was a plan. It was a lifetime of careful saving, of quiet foresight, all for her. For Clara. Tucked inside one of the last bundles she unwrapped, she found a small piece of paper, folded into a tight square. The handwriting was faint, the pencil stroke softened by time, but it was unmistakably Maeve's. The note was short, its simplicity a stark contrast to the immense secret it accompanied. For my Clara, it read. So you'll never have to depend on the kindness of a man who doesn't value you. So your choices will be your own. Be brave. Be free. Live a life that is true. Your loving Maeve. Clara held the note to her chest, the fragile paper a direct link to her grandmother's heart. The tears she had held back for months finally came, silent drops that fell onto the stacks of money, baptizing her new life in sorrow and gratitude. This wealth wasn't an inheritance, it was a liberation. Sleep did not come that night. She sat with the money, the note from Maeve clutched in her hand, until the first pale hints of dawn broke the darkness. As the sun rose, a decision settled over her, calm and clear. She carefully repacked each bundle, her movements no longer trembling but deliberate and sure. She slid them back into the hidden cavity and clicked the panel shut. The dresser was whole again, its secret safe. But everything had changed. She had changed. When she walked into Redemption that morning, the very air felt different. The dust on the street no longer seemed to settle on her, but parted before her. There was a new straightness in her back, a new focus in her gaze. She did not look like a woman who had come into a fortune. She looked like a woman who had finally come into her own. Her first stop was Gable's general store. The bell clanked as she entered. Mr. Gable was at his ledger, his pen scratching away. He looked up, his usual expression of weary impatience already forming. "Clara! What is it now?" She walked directly to the counter and placed a crisp, $100 bill on the wormwood. It lay there between them, a silent testament to a world he could not imagine. His eyes widened. He picked it up, holding it to the light, running a thumb over the engraving as if it might be a mirage. "My debt," Clara said, her voice even and clear. "And for the finest provisions you have. Smoked ham, coffee, sugar, tins of peaches." Everything. And Mr. Gable stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. Where did you get this?" She met his stunned gaze without flinching. "I settled an old family account." She offered no other explanation. She didn't need to. The power in the room had shifted, and they both knew it. He cleared his throat, his dismissive air evaporating into a cloud of obsequious courtesy. For the first time, he saw her not as a burden, but as a customer. News, in a town as small as Redemption, travels faster than a prairie fire. By afternoon, the story of the widow Clara paying off her entire debt with $100 bill was on everyone's lips. The whispers that followed her now were not of pity, but of suspicion and awe. It was inevitable, then, that Samuel would appear at her door just as the sun began to set, his face a thunderous mask of confusion and accusation. He pushed his way inside without being invited, his eyes sweeping the small cabin, searching for an explanation. They landed on the dresser. "What have you done?" he demanded, his voice low and angry. "Mr. Gable is telling everyone you came into money. Where did it come from, Clara? Did you sell something?" "Something of Henry's." He took a step toward her, his posture aggressive, demanding. He believed he had a right to know, a right to her life, a right to her good fortune, whatever its source. A week ago, his presence would have intimidated her, made her shrink back. Now, she stood her ground, the quiet strength she'd inherited from May finally blooming within her. She felt no fear, only a distant sort of pity for him. He could only see the world in terms of what could be bought and sold. "My affairs are my own now, Samuel," she said, her voice calm and steady. "You needn't worry for me anymore," he scoffed, disbelief warring with greed on his face. "Your affairs? You have nothing. You are nothing without this family." She walked to the small table where her purse lay and took out a few coins. Then she paused, and instead, drew out a $5 bill. She held it out to him. He stared at it, confused. "This is for your trouble," she said softly. "For the offer you brought me the other day." It was very sensible. The words hung in the air between them. The insult was so quiet, so perfectly delivered, it took him a moment to feel it sting. He saw the $5, the exact amount he had declared a fortune for her, offered back to him like a pittance. He was speechless. For the first time, he was looking at Clara, and he had absolutely no idea who she was. He left without another word, the bill still clutched in his hand. Clara did not linger in Redemption. The town had been a cage, and Maeve's gift was the key. She did not buy a larger house or fancy dresses. She did not seek the approval of the people who had scorned her. Their opinions were meaningless now, like the dust she was so eager to leave behind. Instead, she used a small fraction of her fortune to prepare for a new life. She bought the strongest, steadiest mare from the livery, a beautiful roan with intelligent eyes. She purchased a new saddle, sturdy boots, and canvas sacks to fill with supplies that would last for months. Her plan was simple: to go west, to find a piece of land where the sky was bigger than the memory of her grief, and to build something of her own. Something that was true. Her last evening in the cabin was quiet. Everything was packed. All that remained was the dresser, standing in its usual place, as silent and steadfast as ever. It was too large to take with her, too heavy to haul across the plains. And besides, its purpose was served. It had carried its precious cargo safely to her. It had been the vessel of her grandmother's love. She ran her hand over the dark wood one last time, a gesture of profound gratitude. The dresser was not just furniture, it was a promise kept, a love that had planned for a future it would never see. It had taught her the most important lesson, that the greatest worth is often hidden, overlooked by those who lack the patience to see what lies beneath the surface. She would leave it here. Perhaps another woman, years from now, would find herself alone in this cabin and see only a useless piece of wood. Or perhaps she, too, would feel the quiet strength in it and choose to hold on. Clara opened the door and looked out at the vast, darkening expanse. The air was cool and clean. For the first time, she was not running from anything. She was walking toward everything.